complex and increasingly volatile national security environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Dunford.
Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis in providing an update on the South Asia strategy. In recent months, our commander in Afghanistan, General Nicholson, has described the current condition in the country as a stalemate. Secretary Mattis has testified that we are not winning, and members of this committee have made similar statements. The situation has developed since the NATO mission in Afghanistan transitioned to an advisory effort. Since January 2015, we have advised and accompanied Afghan Special Operations units at the tactical level, but our advisory effort for conventional forces has generally been limited to the Afghan Corps and institutional level. We also reduced the aviation, artillery, and intelligence support provided to the Afghan forces. This construct did not provide Afghan conventional forces with the support they needed to succeed in combat operations. My military assessment is that we drew down our advisory effort and combat support for the Afghan forces too far and too fast. As a result, the Taliban expanded territorial and population control and inflicted significant casualties on the Afghan army and police while the campaign lost momentum. Last spring, Secretary Mattis directed the Department to conduct a detailed failure analysis to identify the root causes for the lack of progress in Afghanistan, and he directed we provide targeted solutions. Informed by these findings, our commanders developed, and Secretary Mattis approved, a new operational approach to break the stalemate and bolster Afghan capabilities. The new approach supports the President's broader strategy by expanding our advisory efforts to the tactical level, increasing the combat support we provide to our Afghan partners, and enhancing authorities to our commanders. We believe these adjustments will improve the ability of the Afghans to conduct offensive operations, defend critical terrain, and reduce Afghan casualties. The emphasis is on providing effective support to the over 300,000 Afghans we have trained and equipped so they can secure their own country. Going forward, we will support President Ghani's efforts to reorganize the Afghan forces, which will expand special operations units while reducing less effective units. We'll also continue our efforts to develop a capable and sustainable Afghan Air Force. And finally, we'll enhance and expand our own counterterrorism operations in the region. By next spring, this approach will have our most senior, capable, and operationally experienced leaders advising at the decisive point in Afghan operations. Their efforts will be fully enabled by the support and authorities needed for the Afghans to take the fight to the enemy. As we implement the strategy, we're also tackling corruption, the single greatest roadblock to progress. Our military objectives for this new strategy are clear and they are achievable. Defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and ensure other terrorist groups are unable to launch attacks against the homeland, U.S. citizens, or our allies. Further develop Afghan forces that are capable of managing residual violence with limited international support. Support President Ghani's effort to secure key population and economic centers, and provide an enduring counterterrorism partnership with Afghanistan to protect our shared interests in South Asia. As Secretary Tillerson has recently outlined, this entire effort is intended to put pressure on the Taliban and have them understand they will not win a battlefield victory, so we'll enter an Afghan-led peace process to end the conflict. Thanks again, Chairman, for the opportunity to join you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I thank you for your appearing today. As I mentioned in my opening statement, 16 years ago, I think most of us would have been surprised to think that 16 years later, we would still be involved in a conflict in Afghanistan, arguably militarily the strongest nation on earth. And that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is a tremendous price. 2,000 Americans given their lives. 20,000 more have been wounded. And our commander in Afghanistan testifies before this committee that we're in a, quote, stalemate. That's hard for most Americans to understand. And some of that, obviously, I would have, as I mentioned, is the failed strategy or lack of strategy by the previous administration. And I've said that fairly often. But I'd like to say again that you've been in office now since January, and so far we have not seen the details of a conditions-based strategy that will bring about an end to the conflict in Afghanistan. We've had as many as 100,000 troops in Afghanistan at one time or another, and it didn't end the conflict. I'd like for you to tell me how the inclusion of 2,500 is going to change the battlefield equation, including the fact that we have a classic West Point text of an enemy that is based in a sanctuary, that has a sanctuary in Pakistan. We know the street address of the Haqqani network in Quetta. We know where they are. We know what they're doing. We know what they're doing across the border, and yet we still have not, with any effectiveness in the last 16 years, restricted their activities and have had any particular progress in eliminating their sanctuary status. I'd just like to add one other point is, General Nicholson said that we are in a, quote, stalemate. After 16 years, should the taxpayers of America be satisfied that we are still in a, quote, stalemate? I don't think so. And then I'd like to finally repeat again, we have had a lack of communication and a lack of information to this committee that to me is very disturbing. There's not two individuals that I admire more than is sitting at the table facing this committee. But I want to tell you again, we will not accept a lack of information, a lack of strategy, a lack of coordination with this committee. And there are several methods, thanks to the Constitution, that we have to try to force a change in that relationship. I've been told by both of you that we have a new strategy, that we are now going to work closely together with the committee, that we are working with various allies. I'm glad to hear that. But if anyone on this committee feels that they have been fully briefed on what our strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq is, I would please raise your hand. So, the Constitution of the United States is something that every one of us raised our hands when we were sworn in as United States senators. One of the phrases, support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Not support and defend the President of the United States, but support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So all I can say is, with my deep admiration and respect for both of you, we're going to have to act to preserve and respect our constitutional responsibilities. The hearing that you gave a week or so ago, I thought it was nice to hear. I thought it was a lot of interesting information. But I certainly didn't think it was sufficient information for us to act on the Defense Authorization Bill, which provides for the training, equipping, protection, and capabilities of the men and women who are serving, that we represent, that are serving in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, etc. So all I can say to you, my friends, and you are my friends, there is a Constitution, we are a co-equal branch, and we will expect, and I know there's been turmoil within the White House, et cetera, and a number of other personnel issues, but that does not relieve you of the responsibility to keep us informed, to seek our advice and consent, and which is also in the Constitution. And if you don't, then we have no choice but to exercise our responsibilities under the Constitution, which we have. And I regret to say this to two of the people that I admire and respect as much as anyone I've ever known in the war, in my years of service. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I raise this question, Secretary Mattis, because you raised it in your opening comments, and that is the Department of Defense strongly supports Secretary Tillerson's diplomatic efforts versus North Korea. That does not seem to be translated to the President, since he has, in several tweets, suggested that Secretary Tillerson's opening channels and preparing to discuss issues directly and indirectly is essentially a waste of time. How do you respond to those types of, on one hand, you strongly support him, on the other hand, the Secretary's telling, the President's rather, telling him to knock it off?
Senator Reid, President Trump's guidance to both Secretary Tillerson and me has been very clearly that we would, excuse me, that we would pursue the diplomatic effort to include with the various initiatives with China, and to ensure that we pushed on sanctions, economic sanctions designed to keep this in the diplomatic framework for moving forward. I believe that Secretary Tillerson is accurately stating that we are probing for opportunities to talk with the North. All we're doing is probing. We're not talking with them, consistent with the President's dismay about not talking with them before the time is right, before they're willing to talk. So I do not see the divergence as strongly as some have interpreted it. At the same time, the President, I think, has a responsibility to ensure that we go into this with our eyes wide open, with numerous Republican and Democrat administrations in the past having been disappointed in this initiative. I think it is a dynamic balance as we try to go forward with a solution, but at the same time ensure we have military options.
Just a final point, I don't want to dwell on this, but in these situations, and I think you're acutely aware of it, the possibility of miscalculation, misinformation, misinterpretation is very real. And communication, even back-channel communications to not negotiating, but simply to be able to send messages, do you think that's vitally important? Because the President seems to be disparaging even those types of messaging channels.
Senator, I think the President dispatching Secretary Tillerson to Beijing here within the last several days to carry messages and to look at the way we can work with them is the most accurate answer to your question, that in fact this is part of a whole of government integrated effort that we have underway right now, and that's what Secretary Tillerson was carrying forward for the President.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And following the Chairman's comments about the need to essentially describe in more detail this strategy, which conceptually seems to be appropriate, but the devil, as they say, is in the details, specifically with respect to Pakistan. The President called out Pakistan, I think rightfully so. But the question is, what are we going to do? What are the options we're considering with vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Well, the first thing is, Senator, we're working with the international community, including Secretary General Stoltenberg of NATO, to ensure that we go in with a unified NATO position vis-a-vis Afghanistan. You're aware that I stopped first in New Delhi on my way to Kabul last week in order to further integrate what the Indians are doing in terms of development aid and diplomatic efforts to ensure that South Asia stability and peace are prioritized, not just by us, or not just by us in Afghanistan, but across South Asia. So there will be a very specific number of things that we deal with Pakistan on, and those will be balanced with the appropriate levels of firmness as we set a new relationship with Pakistan. And we can go into great detail. I'd prefer to do so in your office over what those specifics are to ensure that our diplomats go in fully armed and have the initiative when the discussions open here starting in a couple of weeks in Islamabad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, General.
Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as an observation of one member here, one of the major improvements that I've seen is and I congratulate the Defense Department and the administration for saying that they'll no longer comment on exact troop numbers and imposing public deadlines. I think that's a major change from the previous administration that I think is very helpful. I think Secretary Mattis, and you in your opening statement, you gave a pretty long answer to the question that we get confronted with quite often. And let me just ask for a short answer. We understand that the problem for a safe haven for terrorists and Afghanistan and all these other things, but can you reiterate for the American people just why they should, in a very brief way, they should care about the future of Afghanistan and why we should continue to expend resources and risk any more American lives? What's the short answer?
Why should we continue, sir, is to make certain that Americans can live safely. And when I advise the President on sending troops in a position where they can die, I have to know in my analysis that this is going to sufficiently contribute to the well-being of the American people to put those troops' lives at risk.
That's a good brief answer. Thank you. On the February 21st, Senator Rounds and 4 other members and I sat down and spent quite a bit of time with President Gandhi and General Nicholson, and we made a list of some 8 things that they're looking at for the future. I'd like to just pick out 3 of these and ask you for either one of you for a current status of where we are, because I think you would agree with the 8 points they brought out. The first of the 3 would be the need for more coalition forces to train and assist the Afghan military. The second is the strength and commitment of the Afghan people who want to take their country back, the status of that. And third, shifting the focus to winning versus not losing. Start with the first one, the need for more coalition forces to train and assist the Afghan military. What's the status and the current of that?
Sir, the Afghan forces, special forces, commandos that have our trainers, they have won every time they fought the enemy. Those without have not won. Right now, we're adding more troops for that very purpose. We're bringing in more NATO coalition partners and trying to bring in more of their troops for advise and assist. And we intend to get this down to every corps is going to have a brigade that will have the trainers and the advisors with them. And within that brigade, since when they do offensive ops, there's usually 1 or 2 Kandak battalions, they will also now have trainers. They have not had them in the past several years. That means they were not able to get swift access to NATO air support, fire support.
Yeah, that's very good. Now, the level of commitment of the Afghan people, what's the status of that? How about you, General Dunford?
Senator, thanks. There's a constant polling done in Afghanistan, and the most recent poll came out and said 87% of the Afghan people reject what the Taliban represents, and more than 75% of the people had confidence and trusted Afghan security forces. So I think that is actually moving in the right direction, Senator.
Yeah, because it wasn't that way last February. That's an improvement, an obvious one.
It's a slight improvement from last February, but certainly a significant improvement from 2011, 2012.
That's right. And the third one, the shifting the focus to winning versus not losing.
Senator, that's exactly what the strategy that we've just outlined is designed to do, and certainly from a military perspective, what Secretary Mattis has made very clear that we needed measurable objectives. The objectives, again, to ensure that the Afghan security forces are capable of providing security with a minimal amount of support. That's one element. making sure that the ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the region are defeated. That's a second element. Keeping other groups from conducting attacks against the United States, our allies, that's a third element. And then reinforcing the efforts for the peace process is a fourth element.
Very good. The chairman in his opening statement talked about the quote. In fact, he quoted, "Conditions on the ground, not arbitrary timetables, will guide our strategy from now on." Is either one of you want to take a stab at further defining conditions?
Senator, first of all, that the population centers and the bulk of the Afghan people are protected from the depredations of the terrorists, and that denies them the very platforms they need if they want to conduct attacks against us, our allies, that sort of thing. Furthermore, we're going to have to see a country that is able to provide government services. There's been pretty much a wholesale swap out of many of the old leaders in various ministries, to include the military leaders today across the board, from the commander of the Army on down. These are post-9/11 proven people. In other words, we're getting people in now who are not colored with some of the old ways of doing business that have bedeviled us for so long. Further, we're going to see, in terms of the Afghan military, we're going to see more effective operations in the field, such as we're seeing right now for the first time in the war, with all the corps on offensive strikes going against Taliban and the other terrorists in the country. This will drive them toward the reconciliation, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned reconciliation that will end this war.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you both for being here. I guess I'm still not clear, based on Chairman McCain's questions that he raised, that I understand how this strategy is going to succeed where our past efforts have not. So can you give me a very succinct response to that in the way that you gave Senator Inhofe the response to why it matters?
Senator Shaheen, what we have right now is the ability to make the Afghan military, which has been through some very tough times, make them more effective in the field. In other words, when they go into the fight, no longer will they worry about the high ground. Having fought in mountainous country, it's unpleasant to have the enemy above you. NATO airstrikes overhead denies the enemy ever having the high ground in terms of the dominating terrain. That's a tactical effect that will make the Afghan army bolder, and it will give them more opportunities militarily to take the fight to the enemy. And that would be the way, as we take the fight to the enemy, we convince the Taliban, you're not going to be able to win this by killing.
What was the strategy behind dropping the MOP bomb last April? And was it successful?
Ma'am, that was not a strategy, Senator. That was a tactical event in the field. It was to collapse tunnels that the troops did not want to go into for obvious reasons. They wanted to make it an unfair fight.
Was it
in
successful?
that regard, for the immediate tactical effect, yes, it was. But it was not a strategic. It was not a strategic act. It was a tactical decision by a commander in the field who did not want to put his troops into a position that a bomb could take care of.
Well, you've said, and others have as well, that this war will not be won on the battlefield, that it will be won because there is a peaceful, this is my analysis based on what that means, that it will be determined by a peaceful agreement between the Taliban and the Afghans, and I assume other players in the region would need to be part of that. So I know that proactively going after the Taliban is designed to try and bring them to the table. But again, do we think that just because there is now air cover for the troops, the Afghan army, that's going to be enough to bring them to the table? And I guess the second part of that question is, why, I assume that the United States would be part of any agreement there, and why, given what Libya and Ukraine and other countries have seen with respect to our changing our commitments around their weapons, why would the Taliban think that they can negotiate with the U.S. at the table in a way that would provide certainty about what the future might hold?
Senator, if I could take the first
part
of the question. For many years, to include the years that I was in Afghanistan, there was a decidedly short-term view, and one thing that was really evident to me was hedging behavior by the Afghan people, by the Taliban, by regional actors, because there was always a sense that the United States was going to pull out in 12 months. And in fact, in Afghanistan, it was known as the Y2K effect. At the end of every year, the expectation was that Afghanistan was going to be confronted with an enemy with no support. And the Taliban, frankly, fed that message to their fighters, and that's how they motivated their people year after year, was one more year in a fight, and then we're going to defeat the coalition. They're going to leave Afghanistan. I think one of the more significant things about the conditions-based approach here is that the Taliban, and we've already started to see this in the intelligence, the Taliban no longer have a short-term horizon to motivate their people. In fact, the impact, I think, has been fairly significant. Will that be sufficient to bring them to the table? I don't know, but we have not, to this point, presented the Taliban with a conditions-based approach that extends the horizon out for our commitment, makes an enduring commitment, and causes Taliban leadership now to approach their subordinates with that context.
Very quickly, Senator, the polling the chairman indicated shows that the overwhelming bulk of the Afghan people don't buy the Taliban's outcome. They don't agree with it. They don't agree that girls don't go to school. They don't agree that everyone's got to act in a certain way. And based on that, and having seen the Afghan forces put up with very severe casualties, fortunately going down now and still holding the line, we now see a regenerated sense that they can push the Taliban into a position where they can have no hope of winning. So it goes right back to what has been established long ago as where this military campaign has to lead to. They stop killing people, they live by the Constitution, and they break with international terrorists. That's a pretty low bar, and we intend to peel off a fair number as they see they have no hope of military victory.
My time is up. Thank you.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, when General Nicholson testified in February, he and I discussed the fact that the boots-on-the-ground limitation forced him to hire contractors to maintain helicopters because U.S. personnel would have counted against the troop cap. And this hurt unit readiness, and it also cost the government tens of millions of dollars in his estimate. Under the new approach, are we fixing issues like this? Will we be adding U.S. personnel in a way that allows us to reduce our reliance on these contractors and also help us save money?
It will, Senator Fisher. The challenge is, how do we get the right balance on this? I agree with how General Nicholson characterized that problem to you in his testimony. It is one of the reasons that I decided to add the reinforcements, although the bulk of them will go to advise and assist. Some are going to fill in those gaps where we actually we did not have a wise allocation of a unit's strength as we broke it apart to send it in for those troop cap reasons. So it's something we have to address, and I believe I have the ability to do so now.
When you say you believe you have the ability...
Well, I have to look at it, Senator, and make certain. We know we can solve a lot of it. We know that much. But I have to look at the tentacles of a policy decision that's been in place a long time. But I'm very much aligned with General Nicholson's What General Nicholson said, I think, was accurate, and your concern I share.
Are we still looking at a boots-on-the-ground limitation in Afghanistan? Did the president raise the cap, or did he do away with it altogether?
No, the president gave me more. The president gave me more flexibility to deal with this issue, and he has shown himself open when I go in to talk with him to my recommendations. As you know, this was a rather hard-fought effort, as the president challenged every assumption to address some of the concerns that have been brought up already this morning. So he is open to me going back in. But right now, I think I have what I need going in to carry out the strategy as it's outlined. If not, I'll go back in.
Okay. Over the last few years, we've seen a decrease in our combat air operations in Afghanistan. From 2010 to 2015, we saw the total sorties conducted against enemy targets decrease by 84% in a span of only 5 years. During the previous administration, this was coupled with, I felt, very restrictive rules of engagement, and that focused on returning fire rather than allowing commanders to proactively attack those Taliban targets. In contrast, the air campaign against ISIS has reached record levels, with over 21,000 sorties flown in 2016. The use of American air power helped stem further inroads by ISIS, and I think it was used successfully in locations such as Sinjar and Ramadi. Are we looking at something similar, this aggressive action and use of air power, as a new strategy in Afghanistan?
Sir, it's embedded in the revised strategy, absolutely. 2017, as you noted, we have had more airstrikes than any year since 2012. So already you see some of the results of releasing our military from, for example, a proximity requirement. How close was the enemy to the Afghan or the U.S. advised special forces? That is no longer the case, for example. So these kind of restrictions that did not allow us to employ the air power fully have been removed, yes. Okay. That said, we will never fight at any time, especially in these wars among innocent people, without doing everything humanly possible to protect the innocent that the enemy purposely jeopardizes by fighting from in amongst them. That is something we will always take as a absolute in terms of how we conduct our tactical events on the battlefield.
And General Dunford, you spoke in your opening comments about implementing strategy, and you spoke about support for President Ghani and also to improve the Afghan Air Force. Do you see a mission of the Afghan Air Force to work in conjunction with our Air Force, but also in the future being able to take on those capabilities on their own without us?
Senator, absolutely. And right now, both Afghan capability, U.S. capability are being employed in support of the Afghans in an integrated way. Long term, and that's about 6 or 7 years from now, we'll completely have transformed the Afghan Air Force. A key piece of that is the transition from Mi-17 helicopters to UH-60 helicopters, which includes an attack variant. We have, over the past 2 years, fielded the A-29, which is a fixed-wing light attack aircraft, as well as MD-530s, which are a smaller helicopter providing the attack. The Afghan Special Operations Mission Wing is probably indicative of where we believe the Air Force can go. That has been proven to be a very effective capability supporting Afghan Special Operations Forces, and we expect similar progress to be made in the Afghan Air Force. But it's come a long way over the past 2.5 years, and again, over the next 6 or 7 years, we expect the Afghan Air Force to be able to provide the support the Afghans need.
My time is up. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you for your service. I want to associate my remarks with that of Chairman McCain's in terms of the Afghanistan strategy. We know from President Trump that he has an unspecified increase of 3,000 more troops, but most that we know really has come from remarks and statements by Afghan President Ghani rather than our own leaders. And I'm very concerned that the American people cannot make good decisions about our continued investment in this 16-year conflict when they are not told the full extent of our commitment and the number of service members we are sending. Do I have your commitment to be honest with the American people about the numbers of troops we are sending over and what their missions will be?
No, ma'am. If it involves telling the enemy something that will help them, yes, ma'am. Yes, Senator, in any terms of honesty with this committee in private at any time. In closed hearing, we will get as specific as you wish, no reservations at all in private. In talking with the American people, we will tell them we are adding the troops. We'll give approximate numbers. We're not hiding this, but I'd rather not say the specific capabilities or the specific numbers or the location on the battlefield they're going out of the confidentiality we do our troops.
I didn't ask you about any of those details. I asked you about the troop numbers and our mission.
We will keep this committee fully informed as we have in closed hearings, right down to specifics of troop numbers. I think it's better in public we stay in general terms. We have said it's over 3,000, so it's not that we're hiding the trend that we're going in, but I think the specifics are best shared with you alone.
General Dunford?
Yeah, I'd associate myself with the comments of the Secretary. Senator Gillibrand, thanks.
Thank you. I'd now like to talk about the Iran deal. In his address to the UN General Assembly, President Trump said that the Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. It's no secret that the administration is considering not recertifying to Congress on October 15th, despite this administration twice certifying that Iran is in compliance with the agreement and the IAEA having reported 8 times that Iran is in compliance. In fact, General Dunford, in your recent renomination hearing, you responded to a question about the administration's possible intention to walk away from the Iran nuclear agreement by saying that it, quote, would have an impact on others' willingness to sign agreements. The other parties to the agreement may have it clear that they believe Iran is in compliance and that they would not support efforts to renegotiate the agreement. This includes our closest European allies, such as the UK, France, and Germany, as well as countries we need to work with on other areas of conflict, Russia and China. One of the reasons why I supported the JCPOA was because I believed that the terms of agreement gave us much greater transparency. We would know where their mines are, their mills, their all of their production capabilities and sourcing. And so I thought that intelligence was very important, and both our military leaders at the time and our intelligence leaders at the time said that that was so. My view is without this agreement, we will lose that transparency. What is your view on that assessment, General Dunford?
Senator, the agreement right now, what I testified to last week was that Iran is not in material breach of the agreement, and I do believe the agreement to date has delayed the development of a nuclear capability by Iran.
How might either the premature end of this agreement or U.S. unilateral withdrawal impact our insight into Iran's activities, Secretary Mattis?
I didn't hear that, Senator.
How would either a premature ending of the agreement or a U.S. unilateral withdrawal impact our insight into Iran's activities?
Senator, as I understand it right now, and I've been dealing with the President and the Secretary of State on this, it is right now being considered in terms of the security of the United States. By it, I mean we're talking about the law that is passed up here where we have to certify plus the agreement. These are two separate. You can talk about the conditions under one of those and not walk away from the other one of those, if you see what I'm driving at. They're two different pieces, and that is under consideration right now about how we deal both the legal requirement from the Congress as well as the international agreement.
General Dunford, you said that we should focus leveraging our partners that were part of the agreement to deal with those challenges that we know Iran possesses, whether it, the terrorist threat or the maritime threat, and so forth. Secretary Mattis, do you agree with that assessment by General Dunford?
In general terms, I do. The amount of misconduct, I would call it, internationally, whether it be with ballistic missiles, rhetoric, support to terrorists, threats to our friends, Arab and Israel in the region by Iran, are areas where they are open to a great deal, I think, of censure by the international community, and we are not naive about their agreement on the nuclear issue, and we are being very alert to any cheating on that right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid. General Dunford, we've heard it said that America is losing the war in Afghanistan. Is that true?
Senator, what we've said is we're not winning, and it's at a stalemate. And that's my assessment of where we are right now. Is we're not at a point where we can bring a successful political solution to the war.
If the American leadership, including people in this room, including the Pentagon and the executive branch, if we decide to win this conflict in Afghanistan, is there any reason at all why we shouldn't be able to do so?
At the end of the day, Senator, I think it's going to require the Afghan people to actually develop the peace process that will bring an end to the war. What I believe the United States can do in conjunction with our coalition partners is provide the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces the support they need to bring an end to the war.
And is there any reason why we can't provide that support?
Senator, I don't believe there is any reason why we can't provide that support, and I think the new strategy that we're here to discuss with you here this morning provides the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces with that level of support to bring this to a successful completion.
Okay, and this has been alluded to, and you mentioned the Afghan people. Is there any lack of resolve on the part of the Afghan people, including their hearts and minds, to that would be a stumbling block to us being successful in this new strategy?
I don't believe so, Senator. It's very clear to me from my personal experience as well as recent polling that the Afghan people do, in fact, want a better life for themselves. They do reject the ideas of the Taliban. And from an individual soldier perspective, I think the one thing we can all say is that the Afghan forces have been incredibly resilient and demonstrated the will to fight over the last couple of years under the most extraordinary conditions.
They certainly have always demonstrated a willingness to fight. Are we viewed as an invading force?
Senator, I think anything but an invading force. Consistently, the Afghan people have requested us to be there. Our presence is favorable across the country. Again, in polling, typically somewhere between 70 and 80% of the Afghan people want support of the international community led by the United States. We've made it clear that our objectives are to support an Afghan-led peace process, to support Afghan security forces, bringing security to their country. So I don't think there's very, very few people who would consider us an invading force inside of Afghanistan. The vast majority are very happy that we're there helping them to bring peace and security to their country.
And in regard to the new strategy, the new plan, and the new emphasis on America doing its part to get the job done, how do our troops feel about that, up and down the rank and file, General?
Senator, I think if you speak to any young man and woman who has served inside of Afghanistan, they want to get the mission done. They want to accomplish the mission. We certainly, and Secretary Mattis has just recently come back from Afghanistan last week. All they want to know is what is the mission, and they want to have the wherewithal to accomplish that mission, and that's exactly what we're trying to provide to them.
Well, I'm not at all surprised by your answer. Mr. Secretary, let me just ask you briefly about NATO. You met with Secretary General Stoltenberg recently. NATO allies have made significant contributions. How are we doing with upping the involvement of NATO, and are you satisfied with our progress so far?
I need to get to NATO now that we've got the strategy in hand. Now that Secretary Joe and I have gone to Afghanistan and sit down with my counterparts, I'll do that in November. We are already in contact with them, I believe, from 15 NATO nations or partner nations fighting under NATO's flag, for example, like Australia, Georgia. I believe we will see, at least from 15 nations right now, additional troops put in there. There could be more than that. Those are just the ones I have indications right now that they're going to up their game.
What's their stake in all this?
Sir, if anything, they are even more vulnerable than the United States is in terms of transnational terrorists operating out of Afghanistan against the European continent. So they've got a lot at stake here, but I think all the nations from South Asia, India, certainly China's got a stake in this. Europe does. This is a transnational problem, Senator.
Thank you. Well, let me just tell both of you I appreciate your work, and I, for one, support you, and I just want you to tell us what you need, and we'll try to get it for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, very quick, short answer question. Do you believe it's in our national security interest at the present time to remain in the JCPOA? That's a yes or no question.
Yes, Senator, I do.
Thank you. You may have noticed I was talking to Chairman McCain as he was leaving. I'm also on the Intelligence Committee, and I hear varying analyses of the status of Afghanistan from the military and from the civilian intelligence agencies. In September of 1963, President Kennedy sent a famous mission to Vietnam. Victor Krulak and Joseph Mendenhall. Krulak was a Marine general. Mendenhall was with the Foreign Service. They came back and gave wildly different accounts of what was going on in Vietnam. Krulak was very optimistic about the progress. Mendenhall was very pessimistic. Kennedy's famous comment was, "Did you two guys visit the same country?" I believe it would be important and helpful to this committee because the facts are so important when we're talking about American lives and treasure to have a closed briefing. I suggested this to the chairman with DIA, CIA, NSA, all of the intelligence community to get a real status of what's really happening on the ground to be sure that we're, in fact, that it's winnable, I guess, and that we do have the ability to make progress. As you all know, we've lost, the Afghan government has lost 15% of their territory in the last year, and people in Maine say, is this winnable? General Dunford, I know of no one who knows more about Afghanistan than you do. Is it winnable, and what does winning look like?
Senator, if you define winning as making sure we don't have another attack on the homeland from the terrorist organizations that operate in South Asia, and there are, of the 90 that we recognize, international terrorist groups, 18 to 20 of them operate in South Asia. So if winning includes keeping them from attacking us, we can do that. If winning includes getting the Afghan forces to the point where they can provide security for their country with a minimal amount of international support, we can do that. If winning includes meeting President Ghani's goals for security of the population in key economic areas, we can do that. And if winning includes convincing the Taliban that they can't win in the battlefield and they're going to have to enter an Afghan-led peace process, we can do that as well. So that would be my elements of what winning looks like, Senator.
That's a good answer, and I appreciate that. Is there any evidence that the Taliban is interested in a political settlement? Are there any contacts? Are there any feelers? Are there any discussions that indicate that I'm having trouble understanding why they would want to settle now when they seem to be gaining ground, and we've got 8,000 people there, and we used to have 100,000. Why would they now say, well, I guess it's time to negotiate?
Senator, over the years, there's always been small groups of individuals interested in reconciliation. I think the framework to date has always been the idea that you would bring in the entire organization, not peel off smaller units. Number one, I think President Ghani has taken a different approach to the Taliban, and we saw he's already had some success in peeling some groups off. But the other issue is the calculus of the Taliban and what their timeline, what their horizon was. And I think the Taliban have always thought that the international community would lose the will to fight. This being a clash of wills, they always assumed the international coalition would quit, and that would allow them to be successful on the battlefield. I think the most important thing, both from a NATO and a U.S. perspective, the most important thing that has been said over the past few months is that this will be conditions-based, and there is no time horizon for this. And I think that will fundamentally change the calculus of the Taliban. And I think what President Ghani will attempt to do is begin to peel off elements of the Taliban over time who realize that actually achieving their political objectives on the battlefield is fruitless.
I agree that the change from calendar-based to conditions-based was very important. There were a lot of us who advocated for that over the last several years. I think that's of critical importance. Final question, I get this in Maine. The safe haven argument, isn't that an all-purpose argument that, I mean, we've got parts of Syria that are uncontrolled, parts of Iraq, North Africa. There are all kinds of places that are potentially safe havens. My concern is that the safe haven argument is the domino theory argument of our generation. That is a kind of all-purpose argument that would justify intervention in practically any place in the world. Secretary Mattis.
Senator, I think that the problems that grow out of ungoverned spaces do not remain in ungoverned spaces. So that opens the door for your very point.
But there are a lot of ungoverned spaces.
Yes, and so our approach to this is by, with, and through allies, not to take all this on ourselves. I can show you in private, sir, how we look at if we add this many American forces, what's the ratio for the others? If it's anything below about 1 to about 70, in some cases 1 to 250, one American troop gets 250 from coalition or host nation, depending on what the situation is, then I'd probably be very reluctant to go that way. There's a way for us to lead without be carrying the full burden on the American taxpayer, the American armed forces.
I understand and appreciate that's exactly the strategy that you're following. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, let me begin by just thanking you both for your service. We have a great deal of respect for both of you, and we appreciate the opportunity to ask some specific questions. I think Senator King started this out by asking for a yes or no answer from Secretary Mattis, and I'd like to go just a step further than that. With regard to the JCPOA, there is a logic that you have used to determine that it's appropriate to stay within it. Could you share with us the logic that you use in determining that the JCPOA right now is in our, or it is advantageous to us to stay there at this time? Could you share that with the American public?
Absolutely, Senator, and thank you. The point I would make is if we can confirm that Iran is living by the agreement, if we can determine that this is in our best interest, then clearly we should stay with it. I believe at this point in time, absent indications to the contrary, it is something the President should consider staying with. There is another requirement where we certify that it's in our best interest, and it goes into a broader definition of national security, broadening beyond the issue, the treaty, or not the treaty, but the agreement itself. That means the President has to consider more broadly things that rightly fall under his portfolio of looking out for the American people in areas that go beyond the specific letters of the JCPOA. In that regard, I support the rigorous review that he has got going on right now.
Thank you, sir. Let me talk about Pakistan for just a second. President Trump has stated that Pakistan is a large part of the new Afghan strategy. In the past, our relationship with Pakistan was transactional in nature. Right now, how would you categorize Pakistan? An ally against terrorism, a supporter of our efforts in Afghanistan, or an indifferent business partner?
Senator, Pakistan has a convoluted history with terrorism. There can be little doubt that there have been terrorist groups that have used Pakistan as a haven for attacks outwardly, and not just towards Afghanistan. We've seen the attacks on India as well. At the same time, probably few nations, perhaps none, have lost as many troops fighting terrorists as they have. So you have this dichotomy there, and I believe that by working with the regional allies and partners we have, and working with our international partners, there's a way to bring a whole-of-government approach to this, to deal firmly with this, to try to move it back into a positive direction, between the NATO allies and Pakistan and remove the safe havens.
General Dunford, with regard to the strategies being used in Afghanistan today, there's the chairman made it clear that there needs to be a dialogue here with regard to strategies. Could you share a little bit any concerns that you may have as to how you share the strategies, the limitations that you feel are placed upon you with regard to sharing strategies versus simply telling the world what our plans are and allowing our adversaries an advantage in doing so? Would you share with us a little bit your thoughts with regard to what you can share, what you can't, and how you're going to deal with that?
Senator, I can. I think that's a fair question. I mean, I think, first of all, we should be able to communicate clearly the ends of the strategy. If you think of a strategy as ends, ways, and means, what we want to do, how we want to do it, and then the means necessary to do it. So if those are the three elements of strategy, I think we need to be very clear and upfront with the American people in public about what the ends of our strategy are. Of that, there is no doubt. In terms of the means necessary in the aggregate, I think we should be very upfront in terms of how much money it's going to cost, and generally speaking, what are the resource capabilities required to be successful. I think it's in the middle, which is the how we plan to implement the strategy, where many of the things that we would want to do would be best left classified and discussed in a closed hearing so that the Congress can provide oversight, but our adversaries don't find us to be predictable.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid, and thank you for your testimony here today, and thank you to both of you for your incredible service to our country. We all appreciate that. Before I ask a question a couple of questions related to Afghanistan, I'd like to follow up on a question that was asked by Senator Reid, and I think it's particularly important considering last week, General Dunford, when asked about the principal threats to our country from a national security perspective, you put the threat from North Korea as number one, at least in the short term. We talked about longer-term challenges that we will have as a country, but at least in the immediate term, North Korea is something that we need to be focused on. And that's why I'd like to go back to these tweets made by the President, which I will read directly, that came out just Sunday. I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he is wasting his time trying to negotiate with little Rocket Man. And then he followed that up with, save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done, which is a striking statement. In fact, I think most folks who saw those tweets, particularly folks in the foreign policy community, thought that basically the President was pulling the rug out from underneath Secretary Tillerson. And he is our chief diplomat, somebody who's entrusted to find diplomatic solutions to difficult situations. So, General Mattis, I have incredible respect for you as a student of history. You have followed developments throughout our history and have analyzed those and thought very carefully about those. Have you ever seen another time in history, or is there another example that you can think of, where a president would actually pull the rug out from under their Secretary of State as they are about to embark on some very delicate negotiations or perhaps diplomatic efforts to deal with a situation as important as nuclear weapons?
Senator, I think that President Trump dispatching Secretary Tillerson to Beijing to deal with PRC, with China on this issue shows the level of attention and his intent to work with other nations diplomatically by dispatching, I agree, our top diplomat to Beijing to do that very thing. I believe that Secretary Tillerson's remarks about probing North Korea to see if they're ready to talk is what the President was referring to, not the diplomatic effort writ large.
So the tweet that says, save your energy, Rex, will do what has to be done, is that something you agree with?
I believe, again, that what he was saying was the press had characterized it that Secretary Tillerson was looking to talk right now. Secretary Tillerson said he is not. He is probing to see if they're ready to talk productively. And I think it was that nuance that was lost there, Senator.
Very good. General Dunford, you, in your hearing last week, you mentioned from a long-term security concern would be the rise of China is one that we have to be focused on and thinking very carefully how we deal with that. Secretary Mattis, you talked about the Thucydides trap and how we need to avoid that as well in our relations with China going forward. So my question related to Afghanistan is that we're well aware that the One Belt, One Road strategy seeks to secure China's control over both the continental and the maritime interest in their eventual hope, I think, of dominating Eurasia and exploiting natural resources there, things that are certainly at odds with U.S. policy. So my question to both of you is, what role do you see China playing in Afghanistan, and particularly related to their One Belt, One Road strategy, things that we should be looking at in terms of our dealings in Afghanistan?
Senator, regarding One Belt, One Road, I think in a globalized world, there's many belts and many roads, and no one nation should put itself into a position of dictating one belt, one road. That said, the One Belt, One Road also goes through disputed territory, and I think that in itself shows the vulnerability of trying to establish that sort of a dictate. As far as Afghanistan goes, as we try to separate out variables where in some areas we work with China on DPRK, for example, terrorism, I think there are areas where we can work, find common ground with China when it comes to counterterrorism, and we should exercise those areas pretty fully. But we should be under no illusions. There are areas where also strategically we need to confront China where we think it's unproductive, the direction they're going in.
Senator, I also believe there's many areas of divergence, certainly between us and China, but there are some areas of convergence, and I think Afghanistan is one of those where there's some potential. China is threatened by a specific terrorist organization that operates out of Afghanistan. They have worked to develop a relationship with the Afghan government. The Afghan government welcomes any support that the Chinese might provide, and so I view that we can isolate some of the broader areas where we have divergence and actually find China potentially a helpful partner in Afghanistan, particularly with the development funds that are going to be necessary. And the United States certainly is not going to be in a position to provide those funds by itself.
Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Ernst, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today and for your continued communication with Congress on the complicated issue of Afghanistan and many, many other issues facing our nation. A collaborative effort is absolutely necessary to guarantee both policy and posture are properly supporting our national defense. And gentlemen, I appreciate you working with us to get both of these right for the American people. So I commend you on that. Now, Secretary Mattis, some have criticized the administration's strategy as one that defers the responsibility of Congress to the Pentagon and leaves the American people in the dark. And, sir, to that, I disagree. To the contrary, I think that it keeps the enemy in the dark, and I will agree with Senator McCain on this point that it does require Congress to exercise our responsibility to represent our constituents. So, Mr. Secretary, what is your plan to keep Congress informed as we move through the new strategy in Afghanistan? We want to make sure that we are able to inform the American people as representatives of our states, but what would your plan be, and what would that look like moving forward?
Well, Senator, first, I fully endorse the closest possible collaboration and the absolute openness. Sometimes it'll have to be in closed hearing because it'll be that sensitive in terms of its details, but I fully endorse it. The plan would be to maintain constant collaboration and have people up here on the Hill, whether they be in your offices briefing you or in hearings or in any other venue that you think most fruitful. And I've been committed to this since I was confirmed. I have had a few challenges in filling my jobs in the Pentagon, which have impacted my ability to send up here the high-ranking people who can address things at the level that you would expect. But as those jobs get filled, I think this will get even easier. But until then, it's my responsibility to keep you fully informed, and I'll do so.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for making that distinction, too. And we need to understand here in the Senate that there are many positions that still need to be filled. So thank you for that gentle reminder. And then furthermore, do we have your commitment that you will give our council its due regard as you evaluate the success of your strategy?
Well, not only give it due regard, Senator, I need it. This is not a job that can be done by any one person, least of all in our form of government. But your input, especially this committee's input, is welcome.
Well, thank you. And we must exercise our oversight, but I agree 100% with you, Secretary, that the details of the plans should not be open to public and for public dissemination. So thank you for that. I am, however, excited about the new strategy. You mentioned different ways, General Dunford, in which we'll execute this new strategy. A couple of those things: train, advise, and assist at the tactical level rather than of the conventional forces, rather than at the higher level. I think that's really great. It's worked for the Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan. Good to see that. And then also leveraging partners is exceptional, and one thing that we have not fully utilized in the past. Last week, I met with 21 Afghan generals and from the Afghan National Security Force, and they too were expressing unanimous support of the new strategy, and they have a lot of confidence in this new administration. And in addition to the U.S.-led security ops, we agreed that an international effort must be utilized, supporting through NATO and other stakeholders like India, and knowing that India needs to be leveraged in the future as well. So, Mr. Secretary, I know that you were in India. Can you explain to us what their role and how we can leverage them moving forward, and that whole of government support? What does that look like? What do you envision?
Senator Ernst, the Afghan people have come to have a deep and abiding affection for the Indian people. There's a collaboration there that would be based on a very generous and enduring Indian government support for development, for hospitals, schools, for roads, for all the sinews that pull a society together, especially one that's been shattered the way that one has been, the Afghan society has been since the Soviet invasion. They are going to continue. I met with Prime Minister Modi, his Minister of Defense, and his National Security Advisor. They are committed to continuing and even broadening their development support and their support of the Afghan defense forces in terms of repair of their equipment, training their officers and NCOs in their Indian military schools, and training the medical doctors and the medics for the Afghan army to take care of battlefield casualties. So I believe that Prime Minister Modi's efforts will actually be enhanced in the months and years ahead based on the sense that we are fully committed. He can now commit more himself to the stability and prosperity of South Asia. It's in all their best interest.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I do believe that this is up for regional partners to contribute as well. I'm glad our administration is engaging them. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for your service. Secretary Mattis, in your opening testimony, you talked about the 4R plus S, and I was just quickly scribbling. I think the fourth R was reconciliation. One of the things that we've read in the paper recently is the administration trying to make a decision about the Taliban office that's open in Qatar, that was open with support from the U.S. and Afghan government to provide some channel for discussion. And there's a decision, I guess, being made within the administration about whether that office should be closed. I understand no decision has been announced on that. I'm kind of in the fight and talk camp, and I know that there's a fight then talk camp. But can you talk a little bit about at least when you think a decision might be made on that, or what the sort of equities are that the administration is grappling with on that question with the fourth R?
I can, Senator. I think the decision will be made shortly. The equities is exactly the point. Do we have the right people in that office right now? As you know, the enemy, under the increasing pressure they've been under, and the loss of some of their leadership has become increasingly fractious. So in some ways that's good. It means they're now doing more decentralized ops because they can't mount combined offenses, but politically it makes it more problematic to try to find who actually speaks for the Taliban. Secretary Tillerson and I have been in contact on this issue 3 times in the last 10 days. He is looking to make certain we have the right people, so it's just not an office in existence, an office that we can actually deal with. So that's what's going on right now. No decision has been made. I anticipate one would be made soon, but we need to get certain information so we make the right decision.
One of the issues that I think has not been raised during the hearing today is this question of heroin production in Afghanistan, which is, you know, a pillar to the economy and has been a source of financing for the Taliban. What are we making progress in that? I know it's very, very difficult. I mean, heroin doesn't have to be, you know, refrigerated and it doesn't rot. Poppies don't, and other agricultural products have that problem. So it's hard to switch folks over to it. But as long as heroin's raised and it's a source of financing for the Taliban and other miscreants, I know it creates challenges for you. So could you share progress on that front?
Yes, sir. The poppy is a very hardy crop, and it doesn't take a lot of tending. So in that growing season they have in that terrain, it's a strong crop. In our counter-finance effort, which is very multifaceted, the counter-drug problem has got to be accounted for. In that regard, we are looking much more at going after the refining locations, the transportation hubs, the transporters, the people who make the money off it, because that's where the Taliban done them. That's where they get their taxation income from. So that is where we will go after in a more targeted way as part of the counter-finance campaign overall, which also includes counter-corruption, because, as you know, the money out of the poppy also fuels some of the corruption. So we'll try to make this an integrated effort against the heroin production, sir.
And I know that there have been a couple of questions about Pakistan asked when I was out of the room. I was actually at the Foreign Relations hearing with the nominee to be ambassador to India, Ken Juster, who was before the Foreign Relations Committee right now. And we were talking about U.S.-India strong mill-to-mill cooperation, your visit you testified to. 2 questions about Pakistan. How does it sit with the Pakistanis, the level of Indian investment in Afghanistan on the development projects you mentioned? And then second, a separate question on Pakistan. Are you seeing the level of cooperation from the Pakistani military and government in battling terrorism along the border with Afghanistan? Is it a safe haven for people to run over from Afghanistan, or is there cooperation there that enhances our efforts in Afghanistan? How would you grade that level of cooperation?
On the Indian investment, sir, I think the Pakistanis look at it with a degree of skepticism, if not distrust. However, in most cases, they can see it's going to roads, into hospitals, so it's hard to dispute the facts on the ground. A point I would make about our South Asia strategy here is it is not an exclusive strategy. It is inclusive for anyone who wants to stop killing of innocent, of terrorism, and restore prosperity and stability. Pakistan need not feel like this is an anti-Pakistan strategy, nor is our relationship or Afghanistan with India an anti-Pakistan collaboration. So it's not exclusive. As far as cooperation on the border, we know the Pakistan Army has taken some pretty severe losses in those attacks. But let me ask the chairman to say a few words about actually how the cross-border counterterrorism campaign is going with the Pakistanis.
Senator, they have done a lot in the border area, and as Secretary Mattis has mentioned, they've suffered significant casualties. In my judgment, what we need is an effective bilateral relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan to manage the border area. We've had a broad framework on that for about 3 or 4 years, and I don't think satisfactory progress has been made. We were encouraged just this week with General Bajwa's visit to Afghanistan. He was in Kabul the day before yesterday. He had very good meetings with Afghan leadership. Our leadership was engaged in those meetings as well. There's at least a commitment now to address those issues and do better coordination along the border area. When we were actually doing that, we had a better degree of cooperation along the border, and we had better visibility. As we drew down the force, that wasn't replaced with effective Afghan-Pakistan cooperation. But I think, as you're correctly pointing out, Senator, that has to be one of the key elements of our success moving forward. And again, I think the pressure we want to put on Pakistan is to move in that direction. First few days, way too early to tell, but the first few days, particularly this recent visit by General Bajwa to Kabul, is encouraging.
Great. Thank you both very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Perdue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Dunford, how would you define victory now? And first of all, I applaud the regional strategy that the administration and you guys are authoring right now. I've espoused that for years, having some background in Pakistan. The relationship between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Russia, China is critical to the solution in Afghanistan, obviously. But how would you now define for the American people after 16 years, what is our current view of what victory looks like in Afghanistan?
Senator, I think it's probably four components. The first is that we would defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda, those specific terrorist groups, and then prevent the other 18 groups that operate from South Asia from conducting an attack against the United States, the American people, or our partners. I think the second component would be that the Afghan security forces, with a minimal amount of international support, can provide security inside of Afghanistan. I think the third component would be supporting President Ghani's initiative to secure 80% of the population in the key economic centers within the next 4 years. He's outlined a plan to do that. And I think the fourth element is supporting the reconciliation process, and specifically an Afghan-led peace process that allows people to solve their problems through that process as opposed to on the battlefield. Those would be the four components that I believe, particularly as you look at it through the military dimension, are necessary for us to be successful.
Including the Taliban in those negotiations, is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. It would be an Afghan-led process, but include the Taliban so that they no longer are addressing their grievances on the battlefield, but they're part of an Afghan peace process.
So from an expectation point of view, we've had soldiers, men and women in Japan, Germany for 70 years. The question is it reasonable to expect, and the first definition of victory about ISIS and the other 18 potential terrorist threats out there, is this a static point in time, or is this a dynamic thing that we have to ensure over the future, really?
Senator, I believe we have enduring interests in South Asia, and those enduring interests are going to require over time a diplomatic presence, an economic presence, and a military presence. I think the nature of that diplomatic, economic, and military commitment will change over time. So in that perspective, the military commitment that we have right now is a moment in time. I expect that contribution, the military contribution, will decrease over time as the Afghan forces have stood up. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I think we just pulled off our advisory effort prematurely before the Afghans were capable of taking the fight on their own. In my judgment, it'll be a few years, but in my judgment, the Afghans will get to the point where the much lower level of support, they'll be capable of actually securing Afghanistan.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, I was just over in Afghanistan, met with, and Pakistan, spent the day with General Bajwa. We went up to the border area and so forth. He intimated that he was willing to cooperate in joint efforts, and I noticed that he's there just this week. Met President Ghani, who also was supportive of that idea. That was back in July. I think time is of the essence here. I'd really love to see more of that potential cross-border cooperation, particularly with the Haqqani network. My question relates to Russia. General Nicholson said, both on that trip and also in public recently, back in December 16, Russia has overtly lent legitimacy to the Taliban by claiming that the Taliban is fighting ISIS. So it looks like we have a joint foe there. The question I have is, Russia, China, and Pakistan just held a conference in December of 2016 on Afghanistan without inviting the Afghans or India, advocating for reconciliation with the Taliban, including the delisting of Taliban leaders as terrorists. What is Russia's end game in Afghanistan today, and how do we counter it in the long-term strategy?
Senator, I'm concerned that Russia's not operating in its own best interest with what it's doing down in South Asia. Secretary Tillerson is engaged with his counterpart in Moscow on this issue, and we'll try to bring some strategic thought into this situation. But I can tell you that We have concerns about what Russia is doing. It may be no deeper than just if there's an opportunity to, poke us in the eye, they'll do it, even if it's against their own interests. But it defies logic that they would see any benefit to engaging the way they have with these other two countries in light of the apparent support. And I can't define that support right now. We're trying to get the intel on it and figure out why Russia is going this way. As far as the other two, I think what we're seeing is Russia trying to be a player in terms of the South Asia outcomes. And I think it's much better we all work together on this rather than exclusively.
Thank you both. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator McCaskill, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much for your hard work, and I think you've got both incredible responsibilities and are handling it well. I was concerned about SIGAR's high-risk report in January for Afghanistan, and as I know it won't surprise either of you to know, based on my history of this committee, that I was particularly concerned about the contract management identification. We have more contractors on the ground in Afghanistan than we have active military, as you all are well aware. We are never going back to a time where we are not incredibly reliant on contractors, and so I have been like a broken record that we've got to get this contract oversight right. Now, this report came out before the report that we learned about the $50 million that went to New Century Consulting to buy Porsches, Alfa Romeos, a Bentley, an Aston Martin, a Land Rover, prohibited weapons, as well as questionable, unallowable expenses, and $420,000 in salaries for spouses or significant others of the CFO and the CEO. So I need to know what your sense is about this. And I need to know who was supposed to be overseeing that contract. And what has happened to that person? Was that a COR that was overseeing this contract? Was it someone higher in the command that was overseeing this contract? I mean, with this kind of contract money going out the door, it just, after all the years we've worked on this with the contracting command, and I know we've made progress, gentlemen, I know we have. But when I see this, after all the work we've done on wartime contracting and cleaning it up, it just makes me depressed. So can either of you shed any light on how we would have had an incident that, to me, shows a real backsliding in terms of contract oversight?
Senator, I have to look into the specifics that you're bringing up. But that said, we have made very clear that the contracting that's going on in Afghanistan must be focused on the combat capability that we are bringing there, that we are going to work with the international donors to address other aspects of development in the country. And I want a review board that is actively, perhaps with its own IG, going to be looking at each of these. And I want continuity of efforts on contracts so people, once they sign a contract, are held accountable for the life of that contract. And right now, I cannot assure you that I've got that, but that's the direction that we're taking this.
Senator, if I could just follow up on the resources. We have worked very closely with the SIGAR, and I think one of the positive changes that's taken place over the last couple of years is, as opposed to just providing a report, we have been really looking at lessons learned and try to incorporate those. We tried a few years ago to move much of the money that we were providing to the Afghans on budget. That didn't work out, and we've significantly reduced the amount of money on budget, meaning that we now are directly dispersing those funds, and we have direct oversight. Secretary Mattis mentioned in his opening statement the compact that has been now signed between the embassy and President Ghani as well, which has given us now visibility into the Afghan organizations as well. One of the things that we did when we did a failure analysis for Secretary Mattis moving forward so that we could answer the hard questions, which are the right questions, the hard questions about why are things going to be different moving forward, is we did failure analysis. And the corruption that we have seen, the contracting we have seen, and the lack of visibility and transparency in the resources were clearly an issue. In fact, I had the SIGAR over in my office as we were doing the failure analysis, and SIGAR was actually a part of our team that put together this failure analysis for the Secretary. So with your emphasis on the SIGAR over time and the SIGAR's corporate memory, I think we have done the best we can now moving forward to incorporate those lessons learned, and particularly in those areas where we're talking about significant amount of money in taxpayer dollars.
Well, you know, and the culture in the military is that when there is a screw-up, somebody's held accountable. And who's held accountable is a big deal as to whether or not that screw-up occurs again. So I would really like a follow-up from both of you, or from you, General Dunford, maybe directly, as to who's you know what is on the line for this contract and the excessive abuse that occurred in this particular contract. Because picking out somebody to make an example of in this area makes a difference. I mean, when we first started down this road, they were just handing a clipboard to somebody, the low man on the totem pole, and said, oh, you're supposed to be overseeing contracts. And it was a joke, as you know, in Iraq in the early years in terms of contract oversight. So I need to know that somebody's held accountable for the Alfa Romeos, the Bentleys, in being bought in Afghanistan.
Senator, I'm not familiar with the details of that contract, but we will certainly get that to you right away.
Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid, and gentlemen, thank you for being here and your continued service. Secretary Mattis, I was here for your opening comments, and I like the way that you framed it around the 4 R's, and I think regionalize, realign, and reinforce they all make sense. I'm more concerned with something that's foundational to ultimately being successful, and that's reconcile. And there seems to be 2 pieces of that I'd like for us to drill down on, and General Dunford, you as well. When I was in Afghanistan last, there was a lot of optimism around some of the economic development that was going on in the country. They had a lot of work to do, but they were getting partners investing money there, and it was helping their underlying economy. There was optimism on the part of President Ghani in terms of infrastructure projects. So I'd like to kind of get a status update on how those underpinnings are working. That's one piece. I'd like to know what, if any, insights we have into popular opinion about the 4R strategy and whether or not we're seeing trending in the right direction among the Afghan people. And then finally, I'd like to talk about what does the Taliban look like in a reconciled country? I mean, do they have a political role to play? And the political process? I mean, what do you all envision as the steps towards successful reconciliation, which would actually have to deal with that?
Senator Tillis, on the reconciliation effort, obviously it's a fight and talk effort, but the underpinnings you accurately point out are what give people hope. I think that progress and violence coexisting right now, what we need to do is expand the security envelope behind which much of this development progress, for which we have a large amount of international support, especially now that they see we're going to stay the course, that will be coming in. As far as the popular opinion, we track it through polls, not only our own polls, they involve polls taken by international organizations unaffiliated with us. We also have our own. I would note that in the last several weeks, one of the things we look at is property values in Kabul. And we just got the readout, and the property values have started going up since we have announced this strategy. In other words, there's a certain amount of commitment now when it's something we can't control. That's why we look at it. You can't. This is an objective data. This is not subject to subjective evaluation. So as we look at this process going forward, we see the development funds coming in largely from the international donors. That's going to help keep President Ghani's optimism fueled with startup kind of money. We also have opportunities in the extraction industries that if we can get the security right in certain areas, that can start creating income for the government. But overall, there appears to be a psychological impact already of what we've done with this, by implementing this strategy. Too early to say that it's because of military success, although, like I mentioned, Senator, for the first time in 16 years, we have all 6 Afghan Army Corps on the offensive at the same time.
General Dunford, anything to add?
Senator, the only thing I'd say is on the third question, which I think is really an important question, is what does reconciliation look like? At the end of the day, what we're helping to do is set the conditions where the Taliban believe they're going to have to come to the peace table in order to move forward. And I think that question is uniquely capable of being answered by the Afghan people. I don't think we can actually impose that. This is something that the Taliban in the context of an Afghan-led peace process are going to have to figure out. How do they incorporate into the political system inside of Afghanistan, and how do they move beyond seeking their political objectives by using violence?
Thank you. And General Mattis, I won't ask you to, or I should say Secretary Mattis, I won't ask you to cover it now in my remaining time, but I would be interested in any information that gives me a sense of the popular opinion trending, what we've seen maybe before we announce the strategy, afterwards, and that's something that I think gives, it's a really good indicator for how well we're doing, because this, we only succeed if we win the hearts and minds. Reconciliation only succeeds if we continue to make positive progress at the same time we're fighting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Reid.
Thank you. On behalf of the Chairman, Senator Donnelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for your service, for everything you've done for our country. Going back to Afghanistan, and I apologize if this has been asked, has it ever changed if Pakistan does not end safe havens? Does it ever change? I mean, we can continue to put more people in, have less people there, do this, do that. Does it ever stabilize if that step doesn't occur?
I think it would be highly difficult to sustain any stabilization in South Asia, not just in Afghanistan, but certainly anywhere around Pakistan, India, unless safe havens are removed.
Well, let me follow up with this then, General or Mr. Secretary. We've tried for a long time. We've had meeting after meeting with the Pakistan government, and I'd like both of you to answer this. What does change their mind in regards to the safe haven policy? How do you ever move that ball?
I think being very clear and firm in what we expect and using all aspects of the government to bring about that change, working internationally. The reason we started with a regional strategy, we didn't start with Afghanistan, then work outwardly, was to make certain we began with a recognition of the role of India, of Russia, of China, of Pakistan.
What carrot or stick, for want of a better term, moves the Pakistan government to change?
Well, there are a number of lines of effort being put together now in Secretary of Treasury's office, Secretary of State's office, my own office, the intel agencies. We are also working with Secretary General Stoltenberg to ensure that NATO's equities are brought to bear. Certainly, India has a role to play as a neighbor and potentially a very strong economic benefit to Pakistan if Pakistan can find a way to carry out its international responsibilities and end any kind of safe haven inside their country. So there's a great deal that Pakistan can benefit economically, diplomatically, financially for its government, economically for its people, by finally sensing that the tide has shifted against this.
General Dunford, is it your sense that the ISI is still helping the Taliban?
Senator, I think it's clear to me that the ISI has connections with terrorist groups. And if I could just follow up on something Secretary Mattis said, I think over the last several years we've had a bilateral approach to trying to affect the change in Pakistan's behavior. And if you think about the coalition, we still have 39 nations that are part of the coalition in Afghanistan and many other interested nations. And so, to the answer to your question, what one thing might change Pakistan, I don't think there is one thing that would change Pakistan, but I find it hard to imagine that we can't get more cooperation if we can fully leverage the multilateral approach with 39 nations that are part of the coalition in Afghanistan, with the other nations now, to include China and India, that are not in the coalition but clearly have vital national interests inside of South Asia. If we can have a diplomatic and economic effort that harnesses all of that potential multilaterally, it seems to me we have a much better chance than we have had to date with a bilateral approach.
If I could switch to North Korea for a minute, and this is obviously speculation, but what do you think gets Kim Jong-un to put a halt? What do you think is what he is looking for in terms of either a decision to make a halt because he feels threatened and or a decision to halt because he feels maybe there's a path forward here?
Senator, if you walk back and you say, what is he doing and why, I think the intel community assesses, and I agree, that Kim Jong-un is on the path he's on right now because he believes that's necessary to enhance the survival of his regime. So he views the possession of ballistic missiles and a nuclear capability as inextricably linked to regime survival. What I think Kim Jong-un needs to realize is he cannot survive with ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons because the international community will not allow him to survive. And I think if there was one area that has been identified by many people as maybe being the one that would most profoundly change his behavior, it would be the loss of oil. And we've seen in the past when he's had when the oil has been cut off, there's been a change in Kim Jong-un's behavior. The fact is he needs economic resources external to the country to survive. And I think when he starts to have the risk calculation of the path he's on and actually the regime surviving because of economic resources necessary for it to survive, that's the best potential, which is why I think we should support Secretary Tillerson's current path of diplomatic and economic pressure to convince him that being a part of the international community, and a key component of Secretary Tillerson's plan has been the prospect of North Korea entering back into the community of nations and addressing their economic challenges. When he views the chances of doing that are more important than the path that he's on, I think that there's a potential for change. And again, we're prepared with a military option should that fail, but I think we're all at this point doing what we can to make sure the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign gets a full opportunity to succeed.
I want to thank you both for your service to the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Sullivan, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for the testimony. I want to echo what a number of my colleagues have mentioned. I think it gives American people a lot of comfort to see the two of you leading on our military and Department of Defense efforts. And just want to applaud you for all you're doing and the focus you're given to some of these really important national security issues and what are clearly challenging times. One area where I don't think you've gotten enough, compliments for what you've done is the ISIS strategy. Came in, new strategy, serious strategy, started to implement it, and we're not there yet, but it's, I think it's clearly working. It's clearly reversing what had been a losing battle, and maybe I can ask you to just initially comment on that, because I think the American people aren't fully aware that they are completely on the defensive now, in my view, in large measure to your leadership, your strategy, and of course to the troops who are executing that. Secretary Mattis, care to comment on that, sir?
Senator, the troops have done a yeoman's job out there in enlisting other forces to work alongside us. It's been a very complex battlefield, as you know, but right now ISIS is seeing its fundraising and its recruiting dry up because of what we've done to them on the battlefield. That said, they remain a threat, and we're taking no sense of complacency here, and it's still a full-fledged fight.
Let me ask next, now you've put together another strategy. I think a lot of us view it in a similarly positive manner. You talk a lot about the regional strategy. I think that's actually really important with regard to Afghanistan, and your focus, which I think is actually critically important on India, matters not only to Afghanistan but to other challenges that we're seeing throughout the country. I think they can be an incredibly important strategic partner of ours. We share similar values, oldest, largest democracies in the world working together. Can you give me a sense, Mr. Secretary, on your recent trip, not only with regard to the importance that India could play with regard to our Afghanistan policy, but other challenges, say China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea and the rise of China, and maybe looking at India as a partner on some of those key issues where our interests align?
Well, Senator, your point about where our interests align is very, very indicative of the current situation we find ourselves in. What we have right now, Senator, is a strategic convergence, generational opportunity between the two largest democracies in the world to work together based on those shared interests of peace, of prosperity, of stability in the region. And India is coming into its own. It's going to be a global player. And I think this is quite right as Prime Minister Modi takes them forward economically to a much higher level of living for his people, to a bigger role in the world. And that role, from our perspective, is a wholly positive one right now. And I think we are natural partners, India and the United States, and we recognize each other's sovereignty. We have respect for each other, but we also see the opportunity we're presented with right now.
So it's safe to say your meetings went well in India recently?
The meetings could not have gone better, Senator.
Great. Let me turn to North Korea, like a number of my colleagues. A lot of concern on that. I, for one, very much appreciate your regular briefings that you've had with this committee. I think they've been constructive. I think they're helping bring both members, Democrats and Republicans, into trying to help with regard to that policy strategy, a very challenging national security issue, as we all know. The main effort then continues to be diplomacy. I know you've been asked this a number of times, but I just want to reiterate that simple yes or no answer on that.
It's diplomatically led, Senator, by Secretary Tillerson. There are economic sanctions that you've seen demonstrated by the unanimous UN Security Council resolutions. How often do we find Russia, China, the United States, France, others all voting as one? It shows the degree of acceptance that this is an international threat, and people are working together imperfectly, but working together to try to address it. And we will continue to maintain a Department of Defense that looks toward the defense of our people and the defense of our allies with military options on the table.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just one final quick question on part of our strategy. It's become apparent that the President and the two of you and others have been talking about how critical missile defense is as a key element of our strategy, not just dealing with North Korea, but rogue nations like Iran. As you know, in the NDAA, we had a number of provisions to advance our nation's missile defense. I know that the administration is looking at additional measures. Could you describe those, General or Mr. Secretary, both in terms of what you want to do, how we can be supportive? I think one of the breakthroughs that you saw in the NDAA this year is missile defense is no longer a partisan issue. It's being viewed very much as a bipartisan issue, and I think that's important. I think you'll get a lot of support for what you want to be doing on missile defense. We just need to know exactly what you want to be doing to advance it in the near term, which I think we need to do more to advance it in the near term.
Senator, we've enjoyed bipartisan support up here on the Hill. You'll notice that the budget for this has increased in the out years and the years ahead. We're optimistic we'll get a budget by December that will help, but also the reprogramming approved by the Senate and the House here allowed us basically $440 million more in FY17 dollars to reprogram to get buy more of the ground-based interceptors, increase the number of sensors, and the emphasis in the near term is exactly where you indicated, and you'll see it reflected in the budget that we submit for your consideration in the future.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thank you very much, Senator Reid. Thank you both for your service. You've been thanked many, many times by this committee, and you certainly deserve those thanks and much more. I know you've been asked about Russian activity in Afghanistan, Mr. Secretary, and you observed that they are acting against their own self-interest. And I know also that when you visited Afghanistan last week, you criticized both Russia and Iran. Could you talk a bit about Iran's activity in Afghanistan, which seems as malevolent and potentially pernicious as Russia's?
Sir, Iran has, over many years, played a very complex role, and at times one that is hard to figure out. They've had their own diplomats killed by Taliban in the past, and yet they've also supported the Taliban at times with small amounts of money dribbled in or weapons and this sort of thing. The bottom line is I think Iran thrives where there is chaos, and you'll see that in Syria. You'll see it in Lebanon. You see it, what they've tried to do in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. You see it in Yemen. And the only consistent theme I can see on Iran is they seem to go where they can create trouble and destabilize countries in their region. It's not in their best interest. We all can see that. I think an objective appraiser would say that that's not in Iran's best interest, but for some reason they insist on doing it.
Why do you think it's not in their best interest?
Because if you're looking out for the best interest of your people as a nation state, and if you're not just acting like a revolutionary cause in order to stay in power, then you want peace, because you're not going to have the kind of economic advantages for your people. You're not going to have the kind of diplomatic engagements with your people that represents their best interest. But I think that those in power right now, in holding the real power in Tehran, they want to play the role of a revolutionary power to stay in power.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Secretary. I want to shift to Puerto Rico, if I may. I want to begin by expressing my thanks to the men and women under your command who are providing essential assistance in Puerto Rico. There are about 6,400 American military members there now, including members of the Connecticut National Guard, whom I saw off just a few days ago. They're deployed in relief efforts that impose considerable hardship on them and some risk as well. So I think they are to be thanked, and my hope is that there will be more of them because more are needed, as well as logistical support, helicopters, and other kinds of equipment there. The military essentially is the only potential resource and asset in Puerto Rico that can provide the transportation and restoration of power and so forth. I met yesterday with members of the Department of Defense, along with FEMA, at the FEMA headquarters. A number of my colleagues and I went there at the invitation of the administrator of FEMA. And what impressed me is the, very bluntly, need for additional troops and resources there from the Department of Defense in order to fill the gap and the disconnect between the supplies that are in the ports and the airports and the people in the cities and interior that need those food, medicine, water, and other essential supplies. So I think there is an opportunity and obligation for greater Department of Defense involvement. General Dunford, you may recall when I asked you about this topic, you said, I'm quoting, "If there is more that needs to be done, I can assure you that Secretary Mattis has placed Puerto Rico as a priority for all of us, and General Robinson is in constant contact with FEMA as well as with officials in Puerto Rico to make sure the department is leaning forward and providing all the support they need, end quote. I hope that commitment is continuing, and I hope that the Department of Defense will have a plan going forward, because as of yesterday when I met with the FEMA officials, they could not assure me that there is a plan for the Department of Defense involvement and for longer-term recovery on the island. So I thank you for the contribution that has been made so far, and I hope that there will be a plan and a commitment of resources going forward.
And Senator, I assure you this is all hands on deck. There is no delay. When a request comes in, it's approved the moment it hits the Pentagon. We have over 10,000 troops there. We had 2 ships pre-positioned. There's now 6 ships there. Comfort will arrive today or tomorrow. And as we had to reopen the airports themselves, which is part of the restraint on how many aircraft we could get in. There was a logistics effort simply to open the door for them to get in. So you bring in a few people, get things opened up, and keep expanding. But there is no lack of resources, sir. We are ready to go, even to the point that it's going to impact the deployments, perhaps, of some of these troops overseas next year, because we've interrupted their preparation. That's okay when it's helping fellow Americans, especially, although we also help some of the other small countries that were hard hit. But when it comes to helping Americans, it's all hands on deck, and we don't have a problem from volunteers from the various National Guards, and certainly every unit, every ship is leaning forward for a mission like this.
I have no question, sir, about your commitment and General Dunford's. What concerns me is that waiting for requests from the local leadership without a larger plan from the Department of Defense may create gaps or disconnects. And I hope that the President, when he's visiting today, will ask for a plan as a result of this trip. And I know that you have a commitment to develop one.
We're in support of FEMA, sir, and that's why we pre-positioned ships and troops, was so even before they asked for it, they were ready. There wasn't a matter of calling up some people. We've continued calling up some, but we had people ready to go as fast as they were asked for.
Thank you.
Senator, one change that's taken place since we spoke last week is Lieutenant General Buchanan, who is the component commander for the Army forces in Northern Command, arrived on the ground with a very capable staff. And when we spoke last, Secretary alluded to it, it was about opening the ports and opening the airfields. The focus now is on distribution. That's what you spoke about. It's the large stockpiles, supplies, and so forth that are getting to the country, but not necessarily out to where the people are. And I can assure you that today, General Robinson's command, but more particularly General Buchanan, who's on the ground in Puerto Rico, they do have a plan to support the distribution of those supplies, and that is their focus. And then when the Secretary spoke about the Comfort arriving, that'll be over 200 more hospital beds that will be available to the people of Puerto Rico tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Heinrich, please.
I want to start by just thanking both of you for your attention on Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. It was clear early on with the radars down, in particular at all those airfields, there were certain things DOD does particularly well and needed to do in order to get those bottlenecks out of the way. So we very much appreciate that focus. I want to go back to Iran and the line of questioning that Senator King had. And start with just asking if Iran maintains its compliance with the JCPOA, but Congress votes to reimpose sanctions anyway, would we, as the U.S., be in violation of our obligations under the JCPOA under that scenario?
Senator, I don't know. I'd have to look at what the conditions specifically would call for under the JCPOA and what in particular we would not be willing to do. Congress has a role to play in this that we see it as distinct but integral. In other words, we look at this problem set as having two distinct aspects, the JCPOA itself and the congressional action. And I'd have to compare the details on that, Senator.
One of the reasons why I ask is because the scenario I'm worried about is if we unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA, I'm concerned about a scenario where Iran gets to keep its sanctions relief, but where we lose key enforcement and intelligence advantages. Is there a scenario where those things come to pass that could possibly be in our national security interest? Because if we're not careful, we could end up with the worst of both worlds, right?
Well, if it's mishandled, yes, Senator, that could happen. It is, as you know, it is still under consideration in the executive branch, and a decision has not been made.
I would just urge you to consider that, because if we end up in a situation where we're not able to reinstate the sanctions that were multilateral, but we also lose our ability to effectively enforce the nuclear agreement, we've sort of lost on both sides of the ledger, and that would be a very unfortunate outcome for our national security. I want to go back to Afghanistan for a moment. I think it's clear that a very concise, clear strategy is essential, both for a positive end state in Afghanistan, but also absolutely key for our troop morale. And I think it's been challenging with a conflict that's gone on for 16 years and a positive end state in many ways still over the horizon to maintain troop morale. How do you describe troop morale in Afghanistan at the moment?
Senator, I was just there a couple days ago, and I got on board the aircraft after our last stop with Secretary General Stoltenberg. And here's an outside observer looking at the probably a dozen different forces, nations' forces there, our own being dominant, of course, of the groups that he saw. And he said, you know, I'm amazed at how high the morale is, that they have such a strong sense of purpose. And I think it humbles all of us to think after 16 years. I mean, I personally landed in Afghanistan in November of 2001.
I remember.
And after 16 years, it reminds us we have a national treasure in the U.S. military, that these young patriots, young people, anyone who thinks we got a problem in the younger generation hadn't seen these lads and lasses in action. They're phenomenal. They look past the hot political rhetoric, say, give me the job, give me the authority, and let me go at it. Give me what I need. And there's a commitment out there that humbles me to this day.
I couldn't agree more with your sentiment with regard to the quality of people serving in our military today, and that's certainly been my experience both here and overseas in places like Afghanistan and, unfortunately, a number of other places as well. I want to ask, what is the current price tag for security in Afghanistan? Are we still roughly spending about $5 billion a year? General Dunford.
Senator, we're spending about $12.5 billion.
12.5.
And 1.1 is the cost of the uplift that we've just proposed.
What is? I think it was General Nicholson who testified at one point that roughly 10% of our total allocations were for security were picked up by the Afghan government. Should we expect to be paying that in perpetuity? Is there any end in sight? Like, what is the limit?
Sure. Senator, where that figure comes from, there's about $500 billion a year is what it takes to sustain the Afghan forces. And the international community coalition has paid about $5 billion for the Afghan forces specifically. The $12 billion was the cost of the entire operation I spoke about earlier. The Afghan forces specifically is $5 billion. About $1 billion is paid by our international partners, members of NATO and so forth, and $500 million is paid for by the Afghan government. We would expect that figure will increase over time and the Afghans will become more self-sufficient. Right now, the Afghans have commitments from the international community in the United States as a result of a NATO summit until 2020. And so after that, there's going to have to be a plan for sustaining the Afghan security forces.
Thank you both.
On behalf of the Chairman, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. And I certainly want to echo, it took the United States military getting into Puerto Rico, and you all are doing the job. If you could, for me, just clarify the numbers. We called the Pentagon last night. They said 1,100 in Puerto Rico. We called the National Guard last night. They said 3,300. And you have just said 10,000. So some clarification on the numbers would be most appreciated. But the fact is that you're doing the job, and it's too bad that it took until late last week to get General Buchanan in place, because once he got in place, things started to improve. So thank you very much for that. So just at your convenience, General Dunford, give us some clarity on the numbers. If you have them now, fine. Otherwise,
Senator, we do. Secretary Mattis and I both have the numbers. We do have over 10,000 on the ground right now. That's about just short of 4,000 in the active component and almost 7,000 members of the National Guard. And that includes all the troops that are currently supporting both operations in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. As you know, because of the multiple storms happening in sequence, we don't have forces specifically assigned, but they're providing support throughout the area.
Okay, that's clearly the step in the right direction. I give you all the accolades that you are due, because that's what it took to get the distribution out into the interior of the island. Since the purpose of this hearing is Afghanistan, I wanted to ask you, Pakistan is sometimes friendly and sometimes it's not when it comes to Afghanistan. And the president has said he was going to put significant new pressure on Pakistan. Can you explain that to the committee? What he meant?
I can, Senator Nelson. The pressure will be, let's put it in optimistic terms, so that they can see where their interests converge with the international community at stopping terrorism. And again, they have lost probably more troops than any other single country in the fight against terrorism. At the same time, we have seen havens left to the terrorists' own devices. We have seen the government of Pakistan come down on terrorism while ISI appears to run its own foreign policy. So what we're going to do is working with the international community and the South Asia neighboring nations, plus China, Russia, looking for common ground with all of these nations and the 39 troop-contributing nations that include NATO plus NATO's partners. We're going to work to have a very firm list of what has got to change. And then using diplomatic and economic means, having venues where we share the way ahead with each other, we're going to try to get this to a productive outcome. Right now, based on a very recent visit by the Chief of Army Staff from Pakistan, there is actually optimism in Kabul that his visit presages a new chapter. I'm in the we'll see mode, but we intend to bring all the effort we can in a whole of government, international framed way to Islamabad and show them how to get out of the situation they're currently in.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Chairman, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Ranking Member Reed, and thank you, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, for your work and for being here. In August, the President released his new Afghan strategy, and a key part of it seems to be the idea that the military will use all of its tools, that the U.S. will use all of its tools, military, economic, and diplomatic, to get the Taliban to the negotiating table. In fact, the Pentagon's release says, and I want to quote it, "We will bolster the fighting strength of government forces to convince the Taliban they cannot win on the battlefield. This will set conditions for the ultimate goal of our strategy, a peace settlement between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban that protects our interests. Now, for some of us, this strategy seems like deja vu all over again. So I just have a straightforward question on this. Secretary Mattis, can you explain to me how you will, quote, convince the Taliban they cannot win on the battlefield when 16 years of evidence suggests otherwise?
Well, the point we're making is, ma'am, that the change to a conditions-based means we set the conditions, we bolster, to use the word that you just quoted there, we bolster the Afghan fighting forces' capability so that the Taliban find they cannot kill their way to power, is the bottom line. It's going to be a fight. We've already seen difficulties in the Taliban's campaign. For example, they're still trying to take down provincial and district centers. They've been unable to do so. For the first time in 16 years, 6 Afghan Army corps are on the offensive. We've never had all 6 of them working at the same time. So you see, that is the way we drive the enemy to the understanding they cannot wait us out. Before, they could wait us out. They always knew what the timeline was for withdrawal. They kept sensing we were leaving.
We've had multiple strategies where people come in and tell us we're using a different military strategy, we're using a different military strategy, and this time it's going to work. I don't think I could count how many times that's happened in 16 years. But the part you're focused on now is that part right at the end that says they can't wait us out. And that's what bothers me, because what it seems to be saying is that the Trump administration's plan to force the Taliban to the negotiating table is to say we are willing to continue to fight the Afghan war forever. And that just can't be right. It can't.
Well,
So-
we're not fighting the Afghan war, ma'am. Again, we're not going to supplant or substitute our troops for the 320,000 Afghan troops whose, fortunately, their casualties are going down now while Taliban's are going up. We are going to assist them in fighting this war, and we're not going to put a timeline on it that the Taliban then gets hope that we can wait them out.
But with respect, Mr. Secretary, you're talking about having our troops in Afghanistan in harm's way forever. And
No,
that can't be right. You're saying that's the key to this.
Well, the point is not forever, because we're saying you can't wait us out. Now, the way you win this, it's a matter of will. It is not, certainly we may have advisors there 10 years from now, but the Taliban will not be the enemy they are. Pulling out, I am convinced, would imperil the people of Massachusetts and California.
I understand that that's your position on this. But I'm very concerned that the central change seems to be we'll wait them out, which is an open-ended commitment that sounds a lot like the word forever to me. Let me ask you about one other thing from that statement. The statement says that we're going to have a negotiated settlement that, quote, protects our interests. Can you just say a word, Mr. Secretary, about what that means?
That means that transnational attacks on the United States would not occur. That's in our interest. We don't be attacked, as we saw coming out of that area on 9/11. And furthermore, the way you do that is helping the Afghan people to have a security force that defends them so they don't have these kind of attacks germinating in their mountains coming against New York City.
And we're going to do this through negotiations. Secretary Mattis, we've now been in Afghanistan for 16 years. 2,386 brave Americans have died. More than 20,000 have been wounded. More than 100,000 Afghans have been killed. We have spent nearly $1 trillion. And after all of that, the Afghan forces still lack the ability to stand on their own. The government controls less than 60% of their territory. They control only a third of their population. The UN reported that opium production in Afghanistan rose 43% last year alone. Endemic corruption continues with no signs of diminishing. Fewer than half of Afghans support the Afghan unity government. I understand the need to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a safe haven for terrorist groups. And I very much appreciate the work you're doing and your coming here today, Mr. Secretary. But as best I can tell, this new strategy is just more of the same, except we've removed the timetables because we have little hope of success within any identified time period.
Senator, we have removed the timetable that gave hope to the Taliban. At the same time, we are going to give support and advice and assistance at a level in the Afghan military that for all the casualties they took, they were not as effective as they could have been. So by making them more effective, the Afghan military will worsen the situation the Taliban face, and we will be ready to talk at any point. But it's the same conditions that Secretary Clinton established for the Taliban: stop killing people, stop supporting international terrorists, and live by the Constitution. That's a pretty low bar that we're driving toward, and it'll be Afghan-led reconciliation is where we're going.
And I just say with respect, yes, it is a very low bar that we're driving toward, and we're losing.
I would disagree with the last point, ma'am.
Well, all I know is to look at the numbers. And the drug trade is up, corruption is up, there's no support for the government, and more people keep dying. And we keep hearing our generals come in here and tell us over and over, just give us one more military plan and it's going to work. And it's just hard to buy that. And it's hard to buy it on behalf of the people who go put their lives at risk.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony, for your service, and on behalf of Chairman McCain, I will adjourn the hearing. Thank you.